Welcome to the Bassanda Podcast. I'm Chris Smith. This is a space for riffing upon history and upon speculative fiction, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Bassanda, the mythical nation, originates in the fertile musical and ancillary imaginations of my friends Roger Landis and Chipper Thompson, and you can find their links in the show notes. When, as a friend of the General and the Reverend, I was first playing with the idea of a fictional alternate universe identity for my own TTU Celtic ensemble, I realized that perhaps I didn't have to invent a world if the lads were willing to let me borrow Bassanda. They were, and here we are. The first speculative fiction novel set in this universe, which is serialized at smithscribe.substack.com, is The Great Train Ride for Bassanda. And I have to pause here for a parenthetical. I have literally just come off the road, just come from the airport, from the huge gathering of the tribes of the musicological and musical theoretical varieties. And so I'm just a little bit fried from the road and have to get on the road again to go meet with my great friends at the University of Delaware Lyric Theater tomorrow. So I'm squeezing this episode in because I love you all. This episode, number 6 in the Bassanda Podcast, picks up on, in fact, provides some craft-related notes, intentions, and backstory for chapters 10 and 11 of The Great Train Ride. As I've previously shared, the principal POV characters in this serial novel are the ethnographer Cécile Lapin in 1906, and then in the 1980s, the Vietnam combat vet and graduate student S. Jefferson Winesap. We've also already met the 1906 heist film-style crew, the assassin and bodyguard Ismail Durang, the explorer and writer Algeria Maine Smith, and the Brethren, two long-lived North American-born friends of Bassanda, Colonel Torres and General Landis. And we've seen these characters in action during a vicious but victorious street fight with Tsarist secret police assassins in the back alleys of Montparnasse after a party with John Millington Synge. Chapter 10 is a note on James Lincoln, later Hobyer-Lawrence, excerpted from the Bassandan Dictionary of National Biography in the 1940 edition. This is that same dossier of sources novel strategy, which I got from various epistolary works, and possibly from some SFF films, but which also shows up in Max Brooks's World War Z, A Secret History of the Zombie Wars book, which is much different than, and in my opinion, much superior to, because it's more rich and more nuanced than the film. Interestingly, this method has actually seen a couple of heydays, both in the current era of hypertext and interactive fiction, with which I've worked some in teaching history settings, but also earlier in the work of some Victorian novelists. And in the show notes, I'm linking to a recent open access article about this dossier novel approach. At the same time, as with all the Bassanda materials, it's my goal, after my great model George MacDonald Fraser in his Flashman series, that the fictional characters should fit in a historically engaged and accurate fashion within the real events, insofar as they're known or knowable, and fitting with historical figures. So one of the ways I prepared for the 1906 Parisian setting was to investigate who was there, both French and foreign-born, to imagine where and how they might have encountered one another, and, very importantly for both characterization and narrative, how these encounters between real and created characters might have shaped both parties' understanding of the historical moment that surrounded them. That means in turn that I have to think about who those invented characters might be, and how their invented biographies might best serve the story. So, in this setting, James Lincoln would almost have to be Anglo, from a moneyed class who could afford to go abroad to Europe circa 1900, and of a family background that would value an international experience and or an education for their offspring. In this new American 20th century, that almost mandated that he come from New England money. It could have been New Orleans, of course, but the heyday for Creoles in Paris was actually the colonial period, up to around the U.S. Civil War. After that war, New England's codfish, banking, and educational aristocracies definitely predominated. So I went back to my early childhood experience and recollections, and I made James Lincoln a Massachusetts boy, born in 1860, the offspring of sugar traders and shippers, which meant he could also have had family and childhood experience of a degree of transnational and intercultural contact. I had in mind the long line of carefully preserved mansions in Salem, Massachusetts of Captain's Row, which mansions were built with the profits from the clipper trade. Though something else that bulks large in my visual imagination as well for James Lincoln is the wildly heterodox plundered collection of Pacific Islands and East Asian material objects that those same windjammer captains brought back from tea trading voyages to the Far East, and which were housed, in my childhood, in Salem's Peabody Museum, about which I've written elsewhere. It could even be possible that there could be ancestors in James Lincoln's family line who might previously have encountered Bassanda, as his companion Algeria Main Smith definitely had done. That Massachusetts Pacific Pipeline also meant that James Lincoln could have had some peripheral contact with the Concord-based school of New England transcendentalists, Emerson, the Alcotts, and predominantly Henry David Thoreau, all of them well-meaning scions of comparative Anglo wealth and comparative intellectual openness. They shaped the consciousness of the Beats in the 1940s and 50s, and before them of the composer Charles Ives, who encountered transcendentalist writings when he married into Harmony Twitchell's family. Here, as elsewhere, I was particularly informed by the late Rick Fields' marvelous narrative history of the encounter between British and North American adventurers and amateur scholars with the East in his account, How the Swans Came to the Lake. So if he were born in 1860 into this kind of philosophical and abolitionist progressive tradition, it would make sense that a boy child might have been middle-named Lincoln, after the young one-term congressman from Illinois who had famously debated Stephen A. Douglas 2 years before. It would also make sense that in their own rather genteel way, his family would have opposed enslavement, but also the brutality and injustice of 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act and the waves of racist violence that surrounded it. The Chinese had been welcomed into the U.S. as poorly paid laborers and strikebreakers in the opening of the American West, and were promptly demonized and expelled once the Golden Spike had been driven in Utah. In fact, after they had built Leland Stanford's railroad, a small group of these Chinese workers were recruited as unwitting scabs to break a strike at a shoe factory in North Adams, Massachusetts, where I live. I once supervised a Chinese scholar's dissertation on anti-Asian bias in period songs, and on a break from editing that dissertation, I walked down into town to take some photos for him of the factory building where those same Chinese workers had been exploited. The tragedy in James Lincoln's life is the untimely death of his young wife Lucretia McPherson, a second-sighted daughter of the Scottish Hebrides and the mother of his 4 children, at the age of only 32. That accounts for the sorrow built into his character, for his abruptly departing his Harvard lecturer's post for Paris, for his children's international and cosmopolitan experience, and for some of the complex personal dynamics between James Lincoln and his friend Algeria Main Smith. He's 43 years old, a widowed professor at the Sorbonne, when he is recruited by the Brethren into the cause of Bassanda. Chapter 11 is a very short one, entitled Where Love Finds Us. This is a short but important chapter, almost an afterthought or short interstitial scene, which is there not so much to further the narrative, but to provide a bit of additional humanizing biography for another important character, and for the sake of further diversifying the cast of my novel. For my day gig job, a co-authored music history of sound, empire, and enclosure with my friend Tom Irvine of the Sounding History podcast in the show notes, I've been reading about the British and American folklorists of this selfsame period, and I've been reminded that a significant percentage of them had been women or non-heteronormative, people of color, or some combined valence of all of these. I wanted to recognize those folks, especially the LGBTQ women, for whom folklore had provided an arena of scholarship slightly less constrained by Victorian ivory tower glass ceilings. There are real, inescapable, and maybe unanswerable ethical challenges and responsibilities in depicting, or especially of writing from or even about, a racial or gender identity not your own. But after all, every novelist does that. In fact, it's part of the novelist's gig to think your way into an experience different than your own. Part of the reason that minoritized voices, black, brown, yellow, female, LGBTQ, get left out of novels is because of the racism and misogyny of Western society since at least the early modern, which is not coincidentally the era of violent exploitation and settler colonialism. If your imperial and colonial project depends upon claiming that you, Anglo, cis, male, global North, are bringing civilization to the savages or saving souls for God, rather than really stealing resources and human beings, then it's hard to justify the latter as the former, except or until you've silenced the voices of those from whom you're stealing. Though state religions have certainly tried, minoritizing people in order to steal from them usually also requires that you silence them. So empathy, respect, and what I'll call in a rather old-fashioned term, good manners, and for that you can see my great mentor Gary Snyder in his The Practice of the Wild, they have to be built into the equation at the same time. But even that is not enough. Because if you're a dominant culture like me, white, male, cis, global north, generational bourgeois, then you can't just borrow those other voices either, or at least not until you balance that borrowing with advocacy and the ceding of space to those other voices. That, in fact, is my day job. I work for a Hispanic serving institution. I'm recognized formally on my campus as an ally to LGBTQ plus folks, and yet I still examine my own privilege and perceptual frames every day, and I still get it wrong sometimes. At least, when you're writing fiction, you can imagine scenarios in which you try to open yourself and silence your inner frames enough to let those other voices flow in and through you. And maybe, most valuably of all, you can edit yourself. And that self-editing is how you learn new and constructive consciousness. So in this scene in Chapter 11, Cecile is dealing with the unexpected shocking news of a violent death, one of several precipitating incidents which will recruit her into the cause of Bassanda, when Algeria Maine Smith unexpectedly begins to talk about karma. Now, I've been an intentional Buddhist for a good 40 years, and I would still never claim that I understand karma. But here's the way I try to manifest it in my life. Life presents us with choices, and sometimes every single one of those choices will cause suffering. The Buddhist way is to minimize that suffering, which may not actually always involve a path of pacifism or disengagement. There have even been bodhisattvas who took on the bad karma of violence in order to prevent worse violence. But at the same time, the Dharma also teaches that such violence, no matter how conscious or intentional or well-intended, will in turn create bad karma. So the path of the Buddha, including Snyder's gentle violence, sometimes means taking on the bad karma of committing necessary violence in order to prevent even worse suffering. But, as Madame Maine Smith puts it to Cecile, violence is always of consequence. So this short scene, from the perspective of a non-POV bisexual woman who herself is not free of karma, foreshadows the inevitability that the violence the brethren commit in the cause of Bassanda is going to carry painful consequences before the story is done. But Madame's story to Cecile, explaining the death of Javier Lawrence's wife, also positions him as someone with sorrow in his past, so that he might leave behind his Sorbonne life, might recover or rediscover a willingness, incongruous though it might seem in a bookish scholar, to take up arms, and even to assume the karmic burden the use of those arms might confer. The scene establishes that people can love one another differently, with or without romance or sexuality, or with a shifting and confusing combination of these things in many different ways and even at cross purposes. This story before the end will implicate James Lincoln and Algeria Maine Smith and Colette Saint-Jacques before all is done. In fact, it's intended as a small gift to these characters, a small oasis of tenderness within the maelstrom of history. This is the Bassanda Podcast, a place for riffing upon history, for world building, for comedy and dialogue and badinage, for bad jokes, historical ironies, and the imagination of a kinder, gentler, richer, and more creative universe. Each week we recall chapters in the correspondence, and we talk with guests from the multiverse and beyond about world building and imagination. You can find us on your podcast app and also Twitter, Threads, and Blue Sky. Search hashtag Bassanda Podcast, send to bassandapodcast@gmail.com, or find me at Chris Smith Muso. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll talk to you again soon.